Is demon possession real? Or is all the past historical accounts of demon possession really just manifestations of psychiatric disease or epilepsy? That's the question we're asking ourselves tonight. Myself and Norty are joined by our guest, Reverend Jim Brooks, tonight, where we're going to be getting into demon possession versus disease. Do they both exist? Is it really just disease? I don't know. We're going to find out in a deep discussion, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're live. All right, we're live for another week. Jim, welcome to the show. Josh, welcome back for another week. I guess we'll start with Josh and then we'll give Jim the floor to get into it. But Josh, what's your general update on the week?
I'm getting over my sickness, starting to feel better finally. So that's my big update on this week. But I'm very excited about this topic. So I'm excited to kick it off with you, Jim, and get things underway here.
All right. Well,
thank
Jim,
you both for having me.
It's a pleasure
to be here.
Yeah. Welcome to the show. How's everything going this week? Obviously, we've got a lot to talk about, but before we get into the heavy stuff, how's life?
Everything is going well so far. Doing some work for our current ministry, which was the Disciples' Call, and just working and staying busy, and in the process, hopefully staying out of trouble.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us tonight for this topic. Obviously, it's complicated. I think this has probably been one of the most interesting topics I've spent time preparing for. I may have done the most reading I've done in preparation for tonight than any other topic in the history of this show. So I'm pretty amped to get into it. Normally, right, we always sort of start with this overarching question. Is demon possession real, or is it just psychiatric disease? That's sort of the theme for tonight. And we generally try to push off into the later in the show what our impressions are. But this show, I want to get right into it in terms of starting with where we all stand. I'll go first. After all the reading I've done, I am 100% convinced demon possession is real. Obviously, there's a lot to get into it, but I'm not going to beat around the bush in terms of where I stand on the issue. Josh, where are you? Yay, nay? Is it real or is it fake?
This is something that I have invested a lot of thought and energy into over, I don't know how many years. So I would not consider myself a religious person. I'll start by saying that. That being said, I lean somewhat into like the spiritual side of things, and definitely think demons, entities, I believe they are real. That being said, I don't think that everybody who says demon possession, is possessed by a demon. And I think this is a super interesting topic to dive into. I always play I want to have one foot in reality and one foot into the possibility of supernatural as well, because I do believe in it. So that's a long-winded answer for where I stand on the topic.
All right. I'm just, as you're talking, I'm just checking on the channels, making sure our live stream's functioning properly, since we don't have Carlos riding in the sidecar tonight. So, all right, that's great. So we got one yes, one
yes,
maybe yes.
I still say it absolutely exists. So
okay,
I'm still a yes. Yeah.
Now, for our guest Jim, what just right out of the gate, what's your impression? Obviously, we're going to break it down over the next hour. Why your impression is what it is, but where you stand?
Well, I'm approaching about 30 years of ministry, and within that 30 years of pastoral care, I've had two instances of what would be described in one account demonic possession and the other demonic oppression. So there's no doubt experientially from my occupation and what I've encountered is that, yes, it is real, but I also agree with Josh's position in the sense that every encounter that we have isn't actually demonic possession, and that great damage can be done from both sides of the scientific community and the religious community by neglecting obvious facts, because we've created a paradigm and we can't deviate from that paradigm because we feel like we give ground to the other side. And that causes the individual that's suffering with these afflictions to be really be alone in that sense. So short answer, yes, I do believe in demonic possession.
All right. So we've got 3 yeses in varying areas, but I think we all kind of see we're all approaching this from a similar worldview, which I think will make for an interesting discussion, albeit maybe not a discussion all encompassing of the diversity of opinions. So if you're out there in the audience, the chat, tell us what you think. Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. Give us a thumbs up, a wave, whatever makes you happy in the chat. But tell us what you think. If we've got some dissenting opinions out there, we'd like to hear them. If you have some agreeing opinions, we'd also like to hear those too. So let's talk about, I guess, the kind of focal point, even though I don't think this was really the intention. There was a lot of things I read in preparation of discussing tonight's topic. But I think ultimately, between what I read, what Jim, you've sort of presented, was that book by Gallagher kind of became a focal point. Did you get any touch point on this, Josh, or
no time to really dive into that at all?
Okay.
So
so
fill me in.
Yeah, I'm going to give the audience, since obviously the audience doesn't have any preparation of, so everyone kind of knows what we're talking about. Maybe I can pull up a quick picture of the book. But basically, this guy, Gallagher, is a classically trained psychiatrist who did his undergrad. Gallagher, I think his first name is Richard Gallagher. Oh, hang on. I'm having trouble chewing bubblegum and walking at the same time. Richard Gallagher book. I think this should come up. Images. Find it nice. Here we go. Picture of the title here. So let me pull this up for everyone. Just Google image search here. Let me
Demonic Foes.
Yeah, so this is a book that we spent I've read about 50% of it now. Jim, you only told me about this book, I don't know what, 48 hours ago or so.
I think maybe Wednesday evening or Thursday.
And so I've been trying to just tear through it as quickly as possible. But to give the audience kind of a baseline of what we're starting at. This guy is a classically trained psychiatrist, did his undergrad at Princeton, went to medical school at, I don't know, where did he go to medical school? I know he did residency at Yale. I don't remember where he went to medical school. Residency at Yale, worked at the Cornell behavioral unit up in Westchester, which is actually a very prestigious psychiatric unit. So very well respected in terms of an academic resume and appointments. And he obviously holds a full professorship, which in medicine is, generally a sign that you've had a pretty full and meaningful career. You're not, a young startup. And he describes in his book basically a career of working alongside, I guess they call them exorcists in the Catholic Church. He does mention counterparts in other,
like some type of paranormal investigators of some kind, I would assume, or somebody who dabbles. I always equate this type of stuff under that paranormal umbrella, because that's always what I've been fascinated with: paranormal shows, paranormal stories, that type of thing. And so I'm sure they work with people who operate in that field as well, which is, I never would have thought of the two worlds merging in this way. And that's why I'm interested for this discussion.
But typically for the non-Catholic faiths, the fundamental or evangelical communities, oftentimes they won't take up the term exorcist. They'll identify their ministry as a deliverance ministry. And he does account the fact that not only was he approached by the Catholic Church to examine these individuals from a psychiatric perspective, but they approached him because he was a skeptic. He wasn't exactly a believer and someone that would just, without significant evidence, rubber stamp a demonic possession label. In fact, he tells you that that's never how he diagnosed these patients. He used a different phrase
In
for
fact,
the
he actually
diagnosis.
says he never diagnoses.
Right.
Right? He'll diagnose psychiatric disease,
Yep.
but he will never diagnose demonic or diabolical events, as he calls them. He basically rules out psychiatric disease and leaves the diagnosis thereafter to clergy.
Right. And I would like to make a point. Dr. Gallagher is not the only academic that's written about this type of subject. There have been other academics that have written with connecting topics to this. For example, you mentioned Dr. Gallagher, but in addition to Dr. Gallagher, let's see which camera's going here. Jacques Vallée, Messengers of Deception. He actually has his master's degree is in astrophysics, and he received that from a French university, and he held a PhD in computer science from Northwestern University. And he deals with the subject of alien encounters. And in his opinion, after doing the research, a lot of the alien encounters had more in common with demonic possession than actually alien abduction. Also dealing with the ontology of evil spirits, because we use that term demon so generally. There's some very good academic writing on the subject of the origin of demons, and that's by Archie T. Wright in The Origin of Evil Spirits, as well as his newer book on Satan. And you have Amy Richter, who also does some very good academic writing on the subject of Enochic literature and its influence on the New Testament Gospels and spirits, and how that would have been understood by New Testament Judaism, which really helped, in my opinion, shape a lot of our New Testament theology.
Well, that's something I was hoping we get into, and do I assume a lot of the people doing research on this topic, they take a similar approach where they're not the ones diagnosing with anything, they're ruling out any type of either scientific or medical diagnosis, correct? Which I like that aspect, right? Like they're just looking for an answer, and when they can't find one, they kick it over to someone who may have an answer. But what I was getting at before my tangent was, evil entities, spirits, demons, whatever you want to call it, they exist in almost every culture in some way, shape, or form, dating back to, I don't know how long. You may know the answer to that, Jim, but they've existed in many different religions, writings.
My understanding, basically, since the dawn of time,
right?
The dawn of man, the idea of demonic evil spirits has existed.
Dr. Irving Finkel, he is a curator in the British Museum, and really heavily tied into a lot of the manuscripts, especially from what I've read. What I'm perceiving is a lot of the old Babylonian manuscripts. He has a book dealing with this subject, talking about the first ghost stories, and so he's able to provide non-biblical religious text. It would have been Babylonian secular text or religious text from that community, dealing with demonic possession. Some of it was more of a farce and a show for the priest or those individuals that were creating these incantations or these potions to relieve a person from the ailments or the afflictions that were placed on them by demonic possession, or incantations to even talk with these spirits, because oftentimes they were viewed as disembodied family members coming back to communicate with their family. So the idea of demonic possession, you're exactly right, Josh. It's something that goes back through human history. It is not something that's unique to the Judeo-Christian faith. And there are numerous religious texts dealing in some form of another within the religion of these communities over time, dealing with exorcisms or how to deal with these spirits.
We got a question in the chat from Travis. Welcome to the show, Travis. He says, can we get a definition for demon? You want to take this question, Jim?
Sure. There's actually several different terms that would be used if you're looking at, for example, in the New Testament, and you just look up demon, you'll find the term daimonion. But also you'll notice that there's the term evil or unclean spirit, and from my understanding, and typically the way that I look at that, when it's talking about an unclean spirit, it's talking about something that's ritually unclean. And if we look at some of the writing that's coming out dealing with Enochic influences in Second Temple era theology, and if you're looking for a time frame for Second Temple theology, you'd be looking at around 586 BC up to around 70 AD. And there's some discrepancies depending on who you're talking to of when they established those as hard dates. But typically in that Second Temple period era, you're looking at the idea of the demons, whether you're looking at it in the Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. The terms that are often used for those imply more than one thing. In Hebrew, there's shadim, there's other terms that are used, but the idea for the evil spirits within their theology typically was the disembodied spirits of the giants after their death in Genesis 6, and then later during the Exodus, as the Israelites are being directed in taking the promised land. And you will find cities there that are called harem. They're devoted to the Lord for destruction. And these cities are often associated in some way with the idea of the Raphaim or the Nephilim. And there are some good sources on that as well, academic level resources. Dr. Michael Heiser has 4 books actually on that topic, 2 of which deal specifically with the subject of demonology and angelology. And it is, I think, helpful to be a little more familiar, or as you're getting into the subject. I think a lot of the writings that we're seeing coming out is to be a little more refined in our speech on what we mean by these specific terms, especially when we're reading and we see the term demon. Well, what is it? What is a demon? And that's a good question. Where did they originate? Why do they do what they do to these individuals? And I think Dr. John Walton mentions a lot in his writing about cultural streams. And so I think it's important for us to understand the ancient theology and how the people of the day to whom that text was actually written understood what was being said. And that helps us develop and allow context for our postmodern interpretation and development of our theological concepts around the same subject.
You got any follow-up questions on that, Josh?
Yeah, I cut out for a little bit there.
Yeah. Champing at the bit.
Well, this stuff is fascinating. I think the history of all of this and establishing like a firm understanding for the term demon is important when we talk about this, right? It's, separating like an actual demonic entity from, as you described it, an unclean spirit of some kind, or a different spirit of some sort that isn't necessarily possessing someone. So I think establishing that and going back to how it's been established since it was first recognized is a tricky one, because that's a whole lot of studying and terminology that is way above my pay grade, but it's fascinating to me. So if you had to simplify it down, like if you're going to classify a non-demonic spirit or entity, whatever we want to classify it here, versus one that is certainly a demon or demonic? How would you differentiate between the two?
Well,
Actually, I think I might be able to clarify that
Mhm.
question a little
sure.
bit. But before I do, I just want to catch the audience up. Over here on the right, it shows just a book cover of sort of a book that's serving as kind of the central point of tonight's discussion. So if you're just coming in a little bit late, trying to figure out what's going on, we're talking about basically a psychiatrist's experience and the book that he wrote about these experiences, differentiating psychiatric disease from demonic oppression or possession, as he defines it, and the things that he found to help differentiate between the two. Because the author of this book stands in the position, and I think makes a very compelling case that both can and do exist in this world. And so we are joined by our guest, Reverend Jim Brooks, as we're working through kind of what this means. And we're addressing this question of what is the definition of a demon. And so it seems like Josh has put out this, I think, notion of we have, there's this spiritual world, right?
Mhm.
And in answering the question, what is a demon? You're kind of, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, Josh, you're sort of posing the question of how do you differentiate a demon, i.e., an evil spirit, from something that exists in the spiritual realm that is not necessarily inherently evil? Or in a simpler way, a very simple question, what is the difference between a demon and an angel?
Well, not even to that level. It's, you know, I, when we're talking demonic possession, demons in general, I do think, we start to bridge into this gap of the spiritual realm, or
Mhm.
the idea of spirits. So I'm I'm under the belief that there are spirits that exist that are evil or not inherently evil, and then there's also demonic spirits
Mhm.
or demonic entities that are trying to possess somebody for ill intent to that host. Like, that's the way I look at it, to where I think there can be spirits that are evil, meaning, and not necessarily evil, but they give off a non-welcoming presence.
Mhm.
So how would you put a label, or differentiate from a more scientific perspective than I would, in evil spirit or entity versus an actual demonic entity?
Well, looking at it from the scriptural standpoint, you would typically only look at that in the sense of um, the scripture presents the case that um, there are two realms that exist. There were two realms that were created early in Genesis. You have a celestial realm, what we would refer to as the heavens, and you have a terrestrial realm. And there are creations that exist in both realms. And the angelic or the celestial realm um, has had more encounters moving back and forth between those realms or those dimensions, whereas humans are more limited in what they see, even though we find instances of prophets that are called into the divine council, or like Paul giving a testimony about being called into the third heaven. Those are much more infrequent than what we see where individuals come into the presence of a celestial entity. What we need to be mindful of while we're talking is the term angelos in the Greek for angel, or it really is more of a function than it is a title. It simply means messenger, and that term is applied both to celestial entities as well as terrestrial. And so, as we're looking and going through some of this terminology, and that's really where we kind of have baggage coming into the subject, because we already have in our mind what an angel is or what we think an angel is, and that may not necessarily be supported by the text. And so, what I would say with that is, in the celestial realm, what we would typically encounter would either be celestial entities that are loyal to God and those that are not. Those that are not are going to be malicious. according to the scriptures that we read, their intention is to humiliate, demean, destroy mankind. Whereas those angels that are loyal to God seek man's protection and seek to guide humanity to fulfill the purpose of their creation in the garden before the fall. And there's a lot of different writings on what caused these angels to fall, why they're so hostile to man. Text, and I emphasize the fact that it's non-canon, because we have a thing in our culture, I guess, sometimes where we avoid things that we consider in the church community. Well, it's not the Bible, it's not canon, we can't read it. It has no intrinsic value. And I would argue the fact that even though it's not canon, it did help shape the theological model during Jesus's day. And we see Jesus encountering situations and performing signs and miracles where he came into contact with demons. And to ignore that and to ignore that culture or that ancient theology, I think we do so at our own peril. To answer your question with regard to the spirits, just to keep it simple, you could classify them in that manner. You have celestial entities, terrestrial entities. Within that celestial realm, you have those that are loyal to God and those that aren't. And when we're looking at the idea of possession, and that's typically where we go, and I think a lot of that is popularization in the movies, as well as more recently, I think we've also seen it in the music industry as they're showing videos of individuals that are mimicking things with demonic possession. There's a difference, and there are different levels of possession. And I think there's probably some, well, I would almost certainly say there's divergent opinions on degrees of demonic oppression and possession. And there are two different things. Oppression is not as severe, probably not as dramatic as actual possession. And I would say that in what we would encounter in the religious community, more of what we encounter would be oppression, more so than possession.
On that note, I'm going to go ahead and, because we're getting questions coming in through the chat, and I want to make sure everybody is ensuring their questions are not being neglected. I have a feeling we're going to have no lack of conversation topic tonight. I'll go ahead and take this question from Bishop. He says, have there been brain scans of people presumably demonically possessed compared to other brain scans? To my understanding, from a medical perspective, no. I am not aware of anything that has broached that topic. My personal perspective on the matter is that I think there's one of two things you're likely to see. One, nothing. Two, something that, well, on a scan, probably in this case, not much. If you were to do something like an EEG, which is where you put electrodes on the scalp, where you measure for seizures, or you may potentially see something maybe that mimics what we call an absence seizure. An absence seizure is basically a spell. It's typically occurs more commonly in pediatric patients, where a patient zones out and it's like they just disappear. That's why we call them absence seizures. They're absent. They don't convulse. They don't do anything. It's actually many, many years ago now. I think diagnostically they've gotten much better at it in recent years. But, 10, 15, 20 years ago, I think that these types of things were being increasingly misdiagnosed as ADHD. They just seemed like they were very spacey kids until they realized it's actually a type of epileptiform activity. And it's actually very well treated pharmacologically. So I would not be surprised, because it seems like, at least from having read Dr. Gallagher's book and just sort of understanding the anecdotal experiences that he's reporting, very often when you're dealing with the cases of what he defines as possession, not oppression, the host is basically absent during the period of possession. In fact, described, I think, very similarly to the way Ted Bundy described the way he just was absent when he would kill someone. If you were, tuned in and watched our episode a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about serial killers. So those would be my suspicions if I had to take a guess, Bishop. Next question from John. How do individual minds affect or influence movement on a Ouija board? I don't have any personal experience with Ouija boards, so I have no input on this question whatsoever. Josh, you got anything? Oh, hold on. Why is Josh muted? Oh, you muted himself?
I muted myself so I could cough. Apologies.
Oh, all right.
No, I don't mess. I don't mess with Ouija boards at all.
Yeah,
I'm not bringing those into my house. Nothing. Yeah. I'm good.
I mean, they do talk about it in. It is discussed in the book briefly. I don't know if it gets discussed in the second half of the book. Obviously, I've only made it through about the first half so far, where he's discussing the patient case of the prior gang member, I think from Chicago area, who was part of the, what's the name of it, Jim? The Santa something or other.
I'm going to say Santa Morte.
Santa Morte, yeah, I think that's right. And basically, they would use a Ouija board to voluntarily summon demons. I guess in a way, they used it to obtain information about like enemies and things like that. Like, I guess other gang members that they wanted to do hits on. They would use a Ouija board to summon the demons, and through that demonic communication, they would basically gain inaccessible information about foes or something. It is like briefly described along those lines.
Yeah, in essence, what they were becoming was a medium. The spirits were channeling through them and providing names and information to these gang members of individuals that needed to be removed. I will say, if you don't mind backtracking just a moment back to Bishop's question,
Sure.
Gallagher mentions within his bibliography other physicians or other scientific research around the subject of demonic possession. And Gallagher himself mentioned that he actually examined these people from a medical capacity. And one of the things in which he examined them for was any type of mental disorders, anything that would create seizures, epilepsy, whatever. So I'm sure brain scans were part of the prescribed examination. And within those instances, the other medical professionals who had no compulsion to provide an answer one way or the other than just interpreting the results, found nothing medically wrong with these individuals. And so one of the things that I think that we need to consider within that subject is if something is spiritual, it doesn't necessarily have to manifest a physical result until you see the spirit itself manifest. The individual's not walking around in a full-blown demonic show the entire time.
Well, from a medical perspective, what I would say is if you are not capturing a scan or an EEG, basically during what the periods that Gallagher's describing, where the patient is exhibiting possession, right? I mean, he makes it pretty clear that it's pretty rare from his perspective for someone to be persistently possessed. The demon comes and goes, and it is in the process of the exorcism in which the manifestation of the demon is present,
right?
With the exception of other brief instances, but it's very episodic.
So it's not like these scans are being conducted while the demon is
I think present. If you are truly trying to find a biological correlate, you would have to be conducting an EEG or like an fMRI or a CAT scan, MRI. I'm going to assume medically probably is not going to show you anything. If you really want to see something, my guess would be fMRI changes or EEG changes. Those would be my medical suspicions of things you might see a difference in. And if you're going to see it, you would have to see it during the episode. Just like if you want to diagnose an absence seizure or epileptic activity, right? If that seizure is not happening, you're not going to capture it on the EEG. It's going to, a trained epileptologist can see evidence of brain injury on an EEG. But if you want evidence of a seizure, you need to look at the EEG at the time that it's happening. And that's why it can be so difficult sometimes to diagnose seizures. And that's why when we want to capture a seizure or rule in or rule out seizure activity, you usually have to do it for about 24 to 48 hours. You stick a patient, depending on their clinical status, maybe in the ICUs where I dealt with a lot of them. They're in the ICU. They have the EEG leads hooked up. They've got a video camera on them. They're being recorded 24 hours a day for the period of time that they have the EEG leads on. And they have a button that either they or a caregiver at the bedside pushes when they believe a seizure is happening. Some patients, right, they get these auras. They can kind of push the button if they know it's coming. Other patients, it's very rapidly onset, and somebody at the bedside pushes it for them. And what that does is it marks the EEG collection. So that way the neurologist, when they go back, it's basically reviewing 24 hours, 48 hours of raw video footage. The marks at least give them like indications of like, tune in here, check out, correlate the clinical activity happening at this time with the EEG. And if you see a seizure, that makes it helps them diagnose a potential seizure, right? Mm-hmm. So unless you're capturing that during like an exorcism, I think it would be very, very hard to establish a true diagnostic correlate.
I definitely want to have one of those hooked up during an exorcism now. Just see the brain activity. I think that's a great
we should write a
experiment.
We'll propose it as a prospective study.
I don't see why not.
Yeah.
And this we have more questions in there. We can get through those first, but I just thought of another question. But
let's put it in the chat, Josh.
I'll put it in the chat
next. Type it in the chat for everyone.
Picking back up on the question with the Ouija board is just one means by which divination can be accomplished. And you have a lot of skepticism regarding witchcraft, and we think a lot of it is just superstition or crutches for the ignorant and how to deal with adverse circumstances or whatever. And something that we need to keep in mind with the scripture as we look in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament for that matter, the practice of witchcraft was forbidden, especially divination. Divination is loosely defined as trying to acquire hidden information. In other words, you're trying to interpret the future for someone, find out, what sports team is going to win the next big game, so you know how to bet.
I can guarantee you, it's not the Bears.
It'll be the Bears. Free agency's happening. All right, it's a good off season for us.
If we look at something logically with regard to the scripture, God does not forbid you to do something that's impossible. And he warned the Israelites time and time again against such practices. And we see in the New Testament
perspective, God does not forbid you from doing something that is impossible.
Right.
It's a very profound statement.
And so in the New Testament, we see witchcraft being used by some of the early believers, and upon becoming Christian, they get rid of their books, and it provides a total of the amount of money that was actually burned with these books. And so when you're looking at the idea of demonic oppression or possession, it's more than just this use of this Ouija board. There are so many different ways to potentially create spiritual problems for yourself. Oftentimes it's referred to as opening doors. But we see more and more of that, especially with a revival of paganism and pagan practice. And unfortunately, some people may not even be aware that some of the things that they're doing, their actual significance. For example, how many people in the morning when they get their newspaper will go look at their horoscope? Or they define their personal characteristics by their astrological sign. And basically what you're indicating by doing that is that the stars somehow have an effect upon your future or upon you. And those things then supersede God's authority, I guess, in your mind to direct your course or your path. That's a form of witchcraft. It's a form of divination. And it opens a door. It's not something that's just connected to the Ouija board. But the idea of the Ouija board or similar mechanisms was to enable the person to channel or talk to the dead. Now, the scripture doesn't make the statement that this witch used a Ouija board in the scripture. But if you remember the story of Saul coming to the witch of Endor, because God is no longer speaking to Saul.
It was actually just discussed last night when it was not last night, but last night I was, in addition to reading and other things I was looking up in preparation for tonight's discussion topic, was an interview done by Michael Knowles, who's a self-proclaimed Catholic, conservative, political commentator. So I'm not really surprised at the content that he was making. But he was doing an interview with a previous. How did she define herself? She used to be very dedicated astrologist.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like an hour and 45 minutes. I think I only watched the first hour before I fell asleep, but I felt like I kind of got the whole story in the first hour. I actually don't even know what they were talked about for another 45 minutes. But she talked about her whole story from it starting out simply as yoga to Reiki to I think it's transitioned into astrology at some point, her horoscope, understanding planet alignment and all these things, and how that transitioned into her believing she was actually an alien that was sent to the earth to do who knows what. And like just one day she just like snapped out of it and was like, I can't believe all these things I believed for 10 plus years of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But she talked about tarot cards and Ouija boards and, becoming a medium and practicing her medium skills. And stuff that's totally foreign to me. I've been like, obviously I'm a Christian. I'm a Jesus following Christian. I'm also a scientist. I've just never personally had any interest in any of that stuff. So it's almost like you sort of like meet this new or hear about this type of individual when you're like, wow, I actually I've never engaged in that, element of culture that these people have. So very eye-opening to me.
Well, you look at the story with regard to this witch of Endor and calling forth Samuel the prophet, and the scripture doesn't say, and there's a lot of discussion, and that's I guess a soft word for argument among the theological community of whether or not it was actually Samuel or not. I believe it was Samuel. And he prophesied what was going to happen to Saul and his sons. And
here we go. We got the link. This is sorry to interrupt. This is the link for anybody out there in the chat. This is the link to the individual who was interviewed by Michael Knowles. This is their YouTube channel now. They went from doing an astrology podcast to now they've rebranded and restarted their whole podcast and YouTube adventure as Heaven and Healing Podcast. It's about her path of recovery from, or what she calls recovery from astrology. Anyway, go on.
And there's been several other individuals to do the same thing, Ryan. I think it's Stephen Bancaras is one who gave his life to Christ. He was apparently highly positioned in the New Age community and teaching New Age doctrine. And I'm trying to think of the other lady that came out. She was a very prolific writer for the New Age, and Doreen Virtue, I think, is her name.
Virtue?
Doreen
Very
Virtue came out,
interesting
and
last name for a new ageist.
yeah,
I'm not
right.
surprised.
So it's interesting them coming out of that background and kind of explaining, hey, we've been teaching error for X number of years. We've misled people, and here's the truth in comparison to what we've said. But with regard to witchcraft, it is something that is legitimate. It's legitimate. It happens. That's why God forbade His people from practicing those arts.
But yeah,
By the way, those are also connected in Second Temple era Judaism theology. If you look at the books such as First Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, and it talks about, at least in that Second Temple era, it talks about kind of the origin or the influences that would have started those occultic practices. And so those practices come from rebelling angels. And the purpose for that was for the destruction of humanity. It enabled them to destroy themselves faster in sin and be more efficient in their destruction. So, hopefully that helps with regard to the question of the Ouija board.
all right. Well, we're moving on down the line of questions. Obviously, we're getting a little backlogged. Let's see. We've got Travis's question. How do we empirically validate that a person has demonic oppression, possession versus a manifestation of the person's psyche? So I think Gallagher talks about this a lot. Can we come back to this question, Travis? If you're okay with that, give us a thumbs up. I want to come back to this question. I just don't want you to feel ignored that we haven't gotten to your question. Carlos asks, can demonic possession be prevented? If so, how? I feel like before reading Gallagher's accounts, I would have said yes. I think I'm very confused about the answer to this question. I don't know. What do you think, Josh? You want to take this one? You want to just let Jim take it? I know Jim's got thoughts on this.
Can it be
definitely want to
prevented?
hear it. Do you have any thoughts before we hand the microphone to Jim on this one?
So on that note, I can't say there's like a for sure way to prevent it, but if you avoid activities that open portals or doorways, I think your odds of demonic possession go down. That's my stance. All right.
I think it's a valid perspective, right? What you're getting at is vulnerabilities, right? I think is a good way to put it. I definitely personally agree with you on that point. I think I would have left my opinion at that prior to any reading on the subject. And it's been the more reading on the subject that's made me realize I think it's a little more nuanced.
I do take the stance where you do have to almost open yourself up to it, whether to Jim's point earlier, whether you're using a tool or something that may open you up to this or not. I do think something has to happen where you open yourself up to something coming in, good, bad, or indifferent. That's my take.
All right. Jim, you want to take it?
Sure. Well,
I mean, you don't have to. I mean,
we'll take a shot at it. I think the first thing that we have to define in the question is, are you meaning oppression, which is an external attack, or are you talking about legitimate possession?
Actually, I mean, well, yeah, that totally matters in light of reading Gallagher's accounts. I think prior to reading that, my answer would have been probably exactly the same answer Josh gave.
Right, because the idea of possession is entirely different than oppression. So possession implies possession, ownership. And so if you're looking at it from the scriptural perspective, there are only two sides. You have the children of light and the children of darkness. And the children of light, they belong to God because they've been redeemed by Jesus Christ. And you have those that have rejected God. They have rejected a Savior. Therefore, they are still under the kingdom of darkness and under the ruler of the kingdom of darkness. And so if we're looking at possession from a religious perspective, the Christians are redeemed by their faith in Christ. They belong to God. They are citizens of a heavenly kingdom. Those that reject God and they reject his propitiation, being Christ, then they are, for all practical purposes, they are owned by Satan. They are part of that kingdom of darkness, and so they are his possession. So that the argument then would become: would Satan honor free will like God would? God does not force himself on an individual. He allows them to exercise their free will, even to their own harm. That's part of the concept of Imago Dei, imaging God. And so when we look within Satan's community, those that do not belong to God belong to him. Do they actually have to open a door, or are they simply just an empty vessel that Satan can harass, destroy, and manipulate whenever he chooses, however he chooses, to further his own will and ambition? You know, if you go back into one of the teachings of Jesus with regard to an exorcism, he talks about a demon that's cast out. He goes and wanders in the wilderness. The wilderness was a place of chaos. It was a representation of death, separation. It was usually viewed as the habitation of demons or these strange creatures. So when that demon was cast out, it went to that abode. If nothing else inhabited that individual, it says that demon comes back and he finds the house, this vessel, swept and garnished, no inhabitants. And he goes and he brings back 7 others worse than himself, and they re-inhabit that individual. And the individual's last state is worse than the first. So the idea for an individual is, you as a vessel, you are either filled with the Holy Spirit or that house is empty and available for occupation. Now that probably just muddied the waters a little bit on that question, but it's something that we need to take within the context before we make a decision on just answering yes or no about having to open a door with regard to demonic possession. And the best way to prevent demonic possession is to accept the Lord Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and accept his path of redemption and become a citizen of the kingdom of light.
Amen. So I think that is a great transition point. If you have questions, follow-up questions for Jim or anything, please throw it down in the chat. We're going to come back to Travis's question next. Actually, Josh, you had a question. You want to throw your question out there?
It was very similar to what Travis is asking, so we can touch on all that together.
Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to take a quick pause. We'll let everyone catch up, since I think there's a great transition point. If you have questions about anything up to this point, put it in the chat for us so we can answer your questions. We can get involved in the conversation. It's been a great night of discussion so far. But let's take a quick pause, because while we've had a wonderful discussion, you might be wondering, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, it's because myself, Norty, our guest, Jim, we're passionate about brain and spine health, among many other things. But the reason this live stream exists is because brain and spine health is a problem in the world. We particularly on this show support veterans in their goal towards recovery from traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, PTSD, all the different brain and spine ailments that affect veterans. And we use this live stream show as a collaboration with a nonprofit organization, Brain and Spine Group, which is committed to the global mission of improving brain and spine health around the world. So if you want to support that mission, if you want to keep us active, you can scan the QR code in the top left corner. You can donate to the organization. And what that money does is it goes towards helping us continue our nonprofit programs, like providing healthcare advocacy for veterans. We have people here in the organization that meet with veterans, take calls from veterans, help them contact the VA, help them contact consultants to get the healthcare and the disability benefits that they need. We have support groups for veterans to come and discuss any issues, whether it's an issue of the psychiatric mind of PTSD, the physical mind, traumatic brain injury, or even the spiritual mind. We treat the whole person as someone that we care about as a veteran of our military. So if you want to support that part of Brain and Spine Group, That's what our show, the Rad and Norty Show, does. We live stream to have fun talking about these great issues, but also to raise awareness and funds for the veteran service programs of Brain and Spine Group. If veteran service isn't your thing, but you love brain and spine health, you could still go over to our website, brainandspinegroup.org. Let me throw up our ticker here for everyone. Let's see, where is it? It's got to be here somewhere. Caption. There we go. I guess that's our YouTube channel. But anyway, you can go to our website or our YouTube channel. You're probably already at our YouTube channel, www.brainandspinegroup.org. On that website, you can read about all the other things that we do, from neuroeducation for advancing professional education, patient and veteran education about brain and spine injury and illness. We have research programs where we have teams of students and doctors who get together to ask the most pressing questions about what the future is for brain and spine health, and digging into them with student-led research projects. Again, the Brain and Spine Group is an organization committed to all phases of improving brain and spine health, from the individual all the way up to the research and the education of professionals. So if any of those missions resonate with you, you can go ahead, scan the QR code and support us financially. We would greatly appreciate it. If not, we're just glad you're here. It's always wonderful to have a great show. Let's get back into it with the final chapter of the show, which I think is going to wrap up this book by Dr. Gallagher very nicely. Let's come back to a couple questions. We have Travis's question: how do we empirically validate that a person has demonic oppression, possession versus manifestation of the person's psyche? And then we've also got another question from Carlos: is there a way to distinguish between genuine demonic possession and mental illness? Which is, I think, a pretty similar question. Josh is going to tack on to that. I'm going to go ahead and pull the questions off the screen, so that way it doesn't get in the way. Since we've got so many people on the screen, we don't want the question covering up people's faces. But we do want to put it up there. That way, if you're out there in the chat, you can follow along. But let's get into it. How do we distinguish between psychiatric disease and demonic involvement?
Yep.
Jim, you want to kind of summarize Gallagher for us a little bit, and then I'll kind of add my clinical opinion, and Josh can add his questions throughout.
Sure. I think that the type of treatment for the individuals suffering from this affliction needs to be partnered with the religious and the medical community. So I would say the first encounter that I ran into with actual demonic possession, I have to say I'm ashamed to say, in the sense that I was a skeptic. I did not believe that the person was demonically possessed. It wasn't until after, and it wasn't exorcism prayers that were offered. It was just simply a time of prayer. And the woman mentioned that, she had been liberated, she had been freed, and had accepted Christ. And it wasn't until after the fact that we were able to identify the sincerity of her claim. So I think for the religious community, I think we need to, for lack of a better expression, pump the brakes when we have someone coming in and saying, hey, I'm having this problem and I think I'm demonically possessed. I think for the church, we need to look and see if there are indeed medical reasons for the issues that they're having, whether it's a chemical imbalance, whether it's a mental disorder, just before we arbitrarily decide to start performing an exorcism. I also think when we're evaluating these individuals, just as Dr. Gallagher had mentioned, he sent these individuals for every medical test that he could think of to rule out any possible medical diagnosis, and nothing was found. These individuals rated high as far as psychiatric evaluations, blood work, other tests that he would send them for came back negative. The physicians could find nothing, but yet these manifestations kept occurring. And I think for me, for my own personal curiosity, is how some of these things are actually able to happen medically. So, for example, some of the signs that are typically agreed to by some of the exorcists or those in deliverance ministries, manifestations of an individual speaking in a language that they have no possible way of knowing. For example, you'll have an individual that I think there was Gallagher mentions there was a woman, she was speaking perfect ecclesiastical Latin. She had no background in Catholicism that I'm aware of, according to his writing. The woman should have had no idea about that language. And it's not just Gallagher, it's others. Father Lambert, who is a fairly popular exorcist priest that's written some material on that and done interviews on YouTube, if you're interested in looking at his accounts. These individuals will speak in Greek, Hebrew, or a language, like I said, that they have no way of knowing.
Yeah, I think
And
that's Bulgarian was one of them.
What's that?
I think Gallagher mentioned one case where they were speaking like Bulgarian or something like that.
So the other aspect of unknowable or presenting knowledge that was not known or hidden knowledge is what's referred to in the paranormal community as remote viewing. And by the way, apparently there's the, depending on your conspiracy theory meter, there are rumors of the United States government participating in this in programs like MK Ultra and the Russian government too, and the idea of remote viewing. And Gallagher himself records 2 occurrences with one of the cases that were brought to him where this woman displayed remote viewing. Both what had occurred in his house the previous night before they ever met. She'd never been to his residence. And the occurrence where she was describing the lead exorcist in the program and what he was doing at that given moment since he wasn't present. And these were confirmed by individuals of impeccable reputation within the academic community, as well as their social standing was unquestionable. They had no reason to lie to present this testimony. And so you have this idea of hidden knowledge. There's also attestation of levitation. And in this one particular instance for a patient he refers to by the name of Julia, you had medical professionals there, doctors and nurses, as well as the team that was assisting the exorcist, testify that this person, Julia, levitated about a foot off of the chair for the span of 30 minutes while they were trying to perform the exorcism rites.
They actually said they had to hold her there, and had they not, they believe she would have floated all the way up to the ceiling. I mean, that's pretty wild.
So you have a manipulation of material creation around you in that sense. How do you ignore levitation? The other was an individual, a young woman that was being exorcised, and one of the assistants within that exorcism was around a 200-pound Lutheran deacon. And this lady was probably, according to Gallagher's description, about 90 pounds soaking wet. And she threw that 200-pound man across the room like he was a rag doll. So what's considered abnormal human strength or superhuman strength is one of the attributes that are looked for. An aversion to holy things, typically if we're looking at from the Catholic point of view, an aversion to holy water, the crucifix, the prayers for the rite of exorcism. More so probably from the Protestants, you're looking at an aversion to prayer, the reading of scripture. But there's an aversion to those things, and oftentimes it will create that manifestation, and that particular entity will begin to blaspheme and make comments to stop what's happening.
Yeah, he also, I mean, so my perspective on the matter, kind of keeping along the same question line, is there a way to distinguish between possession and psychiatric disease? Sort of the central question of tonight's show. Basically, I think Gallagher presents it in a very healthy, holistic, sober perspective, where psychiatric disease must be the null hypothesis, right? And what I mean by that, obviously, null hypothesis coming from more of a statistical methods, right? You always, like, you can't have an assumption of nothing. right? The default position cannot be nothing in statistics, right? You have to say by default, this is the scenario, and we are statistically analyzing whether we can reject that scenario and say plausibly that this other scenario, maybe the alternative, can be acceptable. That's the gist of statistics, right? When you say, when somebody reports in a scientific paper, it's such and such finding, it was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.05. What they're basically saying is our conclusion, let's think of an example. Well, let's use this as the example, right? Let's assume we're putting it in statistical terms, right? The null hypothesis is the default position, right? You can treat the default position as it is psychiatric illness until proven that it's not, or you can treat it as it is demonic possession until proven that it's actually psychiatric illness. And basically, Gallagher's warning against the latter, right? He's saying the null hypothesis must be that it is psychiatric disease until you
can prove it's not.
Clinically prove that it is not. And only then can a physician turn it over to the clergy to still make a determination as to whether or not they're going to diagnose with demonic oppression or possession. But basically, the null hypothesis, the default position, is that it is psychiatric disease. So hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Yeah.
Some of the other things. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, well, that's what I was wondering, and that makes sense to position it that way because we talked about seizures and things like that for causing some of these, but when you think of somebody claiming demonic possession, it's like, well, are they schizophrenic? Are they have a multiple personality disorder of some kind that's surfacing? And how do you rule those out before you turn it over to the clergy for help with a demonic possession or oppression? And that makes sense when you have to assume it is one of those things until you can just absolutely rule it out. I think that helps in the determination. Yeah,
Gallagher. I mean, to my opinion, was that the most important thing Gallagher is addressing in his book, right? Is what does that process look like? What are the differences that in his experience has allowed him to disprove that it's clinical, that it's psychiatric. So one of the things he comments on is the psychosis. Is that generally psychosis, like true medical psychosis, is very incoherent, right? It can be very hyper-religious, right? Psychotic individuals will exhibit what we call hyper-religiosity, where they become very obsessed with religious themes and God and angels and demons, and they'll talk about it a lot, right? But it generally doesn't make any sense. Truly possessed individuals, according to Gallagher, they make sense. Everything they say makes sense. And that's how he's seen that there's truly a differentiation between someone who is psychotic and someone who is possessed. And psychosis, while it can be episodic, it is generally persistent. It is persistent and episodic. Demon-possessed individuals, it's like almost like lightning. It comes and it goes. And it's insanely dramatic when it's happening. And then the person doesn't recollect any of it. And then the episode ends. A person who is episodically psychotic, they are psychotic, right? It
doesn't go away. It doesn't go away in about.
They recollect their psychosis, right? They may not have great insight, meaning that they may not understand that they're psychotic, but they are not
completely absent during that time period.
They're not absent from that experience.
Interesting.
And that's where, there is a trained element of that, right? As a psychiatrist to understand that difference. And that's why I think these individuals take such a rigid approach, is that you must have the clinical diagnosis as your null hypothesis that is rejected to a certain degree of certainty within a metaphorical 95% confidence interval that, we can reject the null hypothesis of clinical diagnosis and accept the 5% or the remaining 5% probability that this is spiritual.
Mhm.
That's Gallagher's. Does that answer your question, Travis? I hope it does. Also, I think Carlos had a similar question, as well as Jill. I mean, it seems like that's kind of everyone's question right now. Is there a way to distinguish between genuine demonic possession, mental illness? How do you prove it's not clinical? What factors would that be? I mean, I think we've addressed all these questions.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this topic so interesting is it's hard to prove from a clinical aspect.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to have concrete evidence of demonic possession, oppression, anything of that nature. And the way it's approached in these books is definitely interesting, right? Because it's almost the opposite of where you think they'd want to go in with an even keel look, like, hey, let's see what's going on. But it's no, these going in under the assumption that this person is having some type of psychiatric episode, and until I can prove that it's not. And I think that's what makes a lot of
it's a healthy
the
perspective.
readings. Yeah.
I mean,
In this circumstance, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's a healthy way to go into it and really help shine a light on something. And Jim, you outlined it before, get the person the help that they need in an effective manner, right? Like let's find some answers for this person, which Brain and Spine Group's all about. Let's find some answers for people. Let's get them help and let's do it to the best that we can from the medical field, or if there's other options out there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You actually touched on a very interesting point.
That's what I do.
Yeah. Wow. Now that my thought had just evaded me. I literally had this perspective I wanted to discuss, and it just completely evaded me.
That's what I help with too.
Yeah. Can demonic possession mimic clinical characteristics? 100%. It parallels a lot. And I think for good reason, because, to answer the question, yes, Gallagher specifically talks about how psychiatric tendencies do muddy the water in a lot of his more complex cases. But even then, as long as he's diligent and he's empirically based in his psychiatric assessment, he cannot ever diagnose them with a psychiatric illness. Mm-hmm. However, borderline personality tendencies, even though it's not actual diagnostic criteria, do influence his ability to sometimes elicit the correct information from a patient. He does comment on that. Travis just says, thank you for bringing your perspective to the show, Jim. So
Travis had one more thing about being concerned.
Oh, I didn't see that. Good call. What do we got here?
I thought that was interesting. Where it's, for the most part, I'm concerned. This
non-falsifiable hypothesis. It's good. It's a good point.
Yeah, because you can't for certain say. Well, you can't like declare false right away, right? Like that's what this is saying, or like there's no way to like. That is one of the, again, the issues with this topic, or somebody who just wants to deny the position of demonic possession, right? Is like you can't ever have like a definitive answer one way or the other, right? And is that what Travis is saying?
Yeah, well, I think what Travis is getting at, because I've heard this, this perspective brought up a lot, is especially in like political and social debates, which I tend to not infrequently get sucked into the YouTube rabbit hole of watching like hardcore liberals and hardcore conservatives have debates on YouTube. I think for those of us who are just of sound mind, find it quite entertaining. But this idea is, you can't debate. Your position in a debate can't be predicated on a non-falsifiable hypothesis, right? You can't say that this is not true, therefore the default position must be this, right? And you can't, but then you can't disprove. There's no way to disprove or substantiate the alternative, right? The default must be, or the alternative must be provable, right? Or at least able to be discredited. And I think to Travis's point, it makes that that's a healthy question to ask.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a social political debate atmosphere. But I think when you're discussing,
and when you're dealing with things that you can't see to begin with, and you're dealing with things that don't have hard answers. And I'm a person that typically leans on, there's not very few and far between situations is everything cut and dry, right and wrong. I think there's a lot more gray area to absolutely everything. And I think this is one of those things that's a lot of gray area. And in order to try and rule something out, you have to take the type of stance where you're predetermined that you're going to find that this person has a psychiatric issue. Otherwise, you'll never even be able to open up the possibility of demonic possession. And I think that's where this type of topic differs for that.
Well, I'll put it even broader for you. I think similar idea. Yeah. I would say that bringing it back to clinical medicine, Travis, there's a lot of non-falsifiable perspectives in medicine. And the reality is, when empirically based medicine exists, great, use it, right? You should always prioritize empirically based treatment and therapy. But I think, Travis, I know you've been to a lot of these shows. I think you're like somewhere in the undergrad training range, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know why I'm like simulating like I'm milking a cow or something over here. But
over here,
what you'll find, if I'm correct in that, if I'm not, I apologize, Travis. What you'll find is there are a lot of decisions you make as a physician that you just have to accept it's a non-falsifiable perspective. What you know is that okay, Travis is in med school. Okay. So you'll find when you get to the point where you're really making, in med school, you're inundated with empirically based medicine, right? EBM or whatever they call it, because that's what makes up medical school curriculum, right? They're not going to teach you things in medical school that are not empirically based because no one knows. We're all making it up. But then when you get out into the world of practicing medicine, and honestly, I'll be the first to say I'm not the most experienced physician, but I've been out in the realm of treating patients long enough where I can say there are tons of medical decisions made on a daily basis that are basically anecdotal evidence is your best bet. Now, we try to limit that as much as possible, but it doesn't fit, like the existence of evidence-based medicine does not preclude the use of anecdotal-based medicine. It exists. And sometimes that's where you have to weigh risk benefit. You have to kind of do like a risk benefit analysis on a lot of this stuff, right? If a patient comes to me and they say that, I don't know, let's think of a crazy inflammatory example to paint a picture. If they say, Doc, I have shoulder pain, and every time, as long as at 4:00 every day, I lay down on my bed with my head pointing north and my foot pointing to the ceiling, and hold that position for 15 seconds, my shoulder pain goes away. And as long as I do it again for 24 hours, but if I miss 24 hours, my shoulder pain comes back. Okay, that's a crazy story.
That's the only way I lay down, to be honest.
Evidence-based medicine tells me that is very unlikely to be a plausible treatment solution, right? And I'm giving you a very crazy example on purpose to paint the picture, right? But the patient, it is of no harm to the patient whatsoever. From a scientific perspective, we may say, oh, it's working. It's the placebo effect, right? Why would I discredit a patient from indulging in a placebo therapy if it is not a harm to them and in their minds it's working for them? And I think that's where people forget, as physicians, our job is to counsel the patient in a way that is best for them, not the way that's best for us as a doctor. My job is not to say, evidence says this and that's what you get. My job is to say, evidence says this. If you come to me and tell me you want to do something and I think there's going to be a harm to you, right? If you say, well, doc, my shoulder pain hurts, as long as I shoot up heroin at 4:00 every day, I don't get the shoulder pain. Like, obviously, I'm going to counsel you against that, right? But if it's a benign activity, but it works for you, as a doctor, why wouldn't I encourage you to end that path? Now, my personality as an individual is going to be very realistic with you. I'm going to tell you, medically, that makes no sense. There's no biological reason why any of that would work. But if it works for you, keep doing it. When it stops working, come back and see me and let's find out what the next step is, right? That's what I'm going to personally tell someone. So I guess all of this, a big tangent, obviously, I've been rambling for a few minutes now, is to tell you, Travis, don't let the fact that there's a non-falsifiable argument here deter you from landing on the solution that if you've ruled out everything that is medically and empirically and scientifically based, and this is one of the few alternative non-falsifiable diagnoses left, and it is not of harm to the patient, let them pursue that, I guess, would be my personal perspective. Hopefully that answers your question and gives you a healthier perspective and how to approach it. If you hate that answer, give me a thumbs down and tell me to get off the air. On that note, I think we're a little over the hour, which is okay. It's a loose 1 hour time commitment, but with thanks to everyone for being with us tonight. The questions were fantastic. Mm-hmm. I really love this group and what we do. Again, if you want to support the nonprofit, scan the QR code, go to our website, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get notifications every time we go live. Leave us a comment on the video, even after we're live. Leave us a comment if you want Jim to come back for another topic. I'm sure we could arrange it. Questions, comments, anything, let us know. Any closing thoughts, Norty?
Any fun supernatural experiences from either of you? Personal experiences outside of demonic possession?
I'll kick it over to Jim.
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's an interesting discussion. And from the pastoral side of things, we've talked about the diagnosis, the medical treatment versus religious praxis. And I think what really, in my opinion, needs to happen is there needs to be a bridge between the two. As we look at pastoral care, we need to recognize that obviously the realm of medicine is not our purview. And for some of the physicians there, the spiritual side of things may not be their purview. So as we're looking for the betterment of this individual, then it would benefit us greatly, and more so the patient, to come with, I would say, academic integrity. This is what we know. This is what we perceive to be facts. Can we agree on these facts and have discussion about the proper treatment of that particular person for their holistic well-being? And, I think that open that open dialogue between the pastors or the chaplains and the doctors and those rendering medical treatment, it's been my experience that it can work quite well. It just requires that effort on both parts. And not every patient you see that's having these things is it going to be demonic. And my job may be going in as a chaplain just to listen and have a word of prayer with them. But it doesn't, it doesn't have to go beyond that unless that's what the patient is desiring. And if it's it needs to be something that's not forced on the individual. If there is an exorcism that has to be performed, it has to be on a willing patient, not one that's against their will or that's just.
I've actually got a lot of questions about that. I'm going to refrain for the sake of time.
Right.
But I've got a lot of questions about that.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure having this discussion with you.
Great. So on that note, if you've got any burning questions while we close down, put them in the chat right now before we shut down. I'm just going to go ahead and give everybody the update for things coming up. Obviously, thank you all for being with us. We're live next week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern, getting into the psychology of criminal behavior. So a little similar to 2 weeks ago when we talked about the psychology of murder. But I think we're going to go a little bit broader, talk about some of the things outside of just homicide. Why do people rob banks? Why do people join gangs? Why do people exhibit what we call medically maladaptive behaviors? What types of things in a person's mind drive them to these types of things? We are currently looking for a guest for that episode. If not, maybe just Norty and I, maybe stuck with just the two of us next week. If we can find a great criminal psychologist to join us, don't worry, we will get them on the show last minute. If you know a criminal psychologist that wants to come on the show and debate with us, send them our way. We're open to it. But don't mark your calendar for next week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about the psychology of criminal behavior. All the other stuff's basically the same around the organization. So if you want to get involved, reach out to us. Our website's available, brainandspinegroup.org. Any other announcements, housekeeping businesses, Josh?
No, it was a pleasure having you, Jim. I don't know if you want people to be able to find you at all or any work that you're doing. Please feel free to shout it out. But it was a pleasure having you join us.
Well, thank you very much. And if there are those that would like to contact me, Ryan is very familiar with our ministry and contact information. I'd be happy to help with whatever reading recommendations or answer your questions to the best of my ability.
And obviously, I'm personally helping Jim get their new website up and running. But keep checking back. If you keep Googling the disciplescall.org every week or two, you'll get updates. We're hoping to have a live site up soon for Jim and his crew and all the work that they're doing. So I think that's it. We'll see you next week, 7 p.m. Jim, Rad, Norty,